Let's continue, or rather start again. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's start with this piece of writing that I wrote collaboratively with Louisa Crossman, which is one of my research colleagues at the Strelka Institute in Moscow, where, by the way, this program is called the Terraforming. It's running and it's about geoengineering and governance and ecology and more interesting things you should check out. Anyhow, the essay is titled "The Planet of the Monsters," and this is the gist of it. As technology has increased the ability of humans to alter the world in their own image, the appearance of monsters, creatures born from human trespass into the natural order of things, has warned of the inherent risks of such endeavors. But when anthropogenic climate change has eroded any easy distinction between the natural and the artificial, a livable planet may require an embrace of the monstrous. So, when it comes to environmental collapse, the story usually goes as follows. Wrap the latest climate projections into a narrative that conjures nostalgia for the future and foreshadows even more traumatic changes to come, unless humans repent for their sins and return to a harmonious relationship with nature. Since the Western environmental movement officially came to life on the first ever Earth Day in 1970, those rallying cries have changed in tone but have remained the same in substance. Environmentalism has gone through waves of victories and defeats, from rather successful battles against nuclear power, to fetishizing the local, to degrowth, to fascination with indigenous cultures, cherry-picked for their animist tendencies, to the essentialist conception of nature has remained. The movement, which has dominated the discourse around climate change for decades, is predicated on one axiom: nature is sacred and separated from humans who shall not disturb it. And if nature has been disturbed by humanity, all measures should be taken to quickly correct the course of action and retreat away, wherever this away might be, from it, so that the natural order of things can be restored without intervention. Despite the good intention, environmentalism has lived to experience the tragic climatic changes it foresaw. The prophecies of doom that it put out have come true. Meanwhile, the movement achieved peak levels of media visibility thanks to Extinction Rebellion performances and Greta Thunberg sailing the Atlantic. Yet, neither animism nor environmentalism, least of all politics in which children pose as avatars for degrowth propaganda, has been effective in creating the conceptual and geopolitical space capable of hosting the governmental and technological shifts needed for humans to survive dramatic environmental changes. So in response to the real and perceived failures of environmentalism, eco-modernism or post-environmentalism rose to prominence as the techno-solutionist cousin of climate activism. The Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which was published in 2015 and co-authored by the Whole Earth Catalog editor Stuart Brand, which is the same guy that started the environmentalist movement, invites humanity to use their extraordinary powers in service of creating a good Anthropocene. The movement is marketed as an alternative framework for protecting the environment that is consistent with a world of 9 billion people living what somewhat looks like modern lives. So their story usually goes as follows. Take an emeritus Harvard professor that is intentionally locked up in a garage in San Francisco and busy them designing and patenting applications of marine cloud seeding technology, a geoengineering technique used to make clouds brighter and bounce back into space some of the incoming solar radiation, thus lowering climate warming. Now make it look like the oil and gas companies that will buy these patents, the same ones who exploited lands, populations, and resources for decades, will repent for their sins and save the planet by adopting these technologies. So they're the perfect candidates to take the much vaunted U-turn that we need without really unsettling anyone's established business model. The illustrious men in basements scattered across Silicon Valley represent the quintessential modernist technocratic vision: defy nature, be in control, save the world with genius interventions. This narrative is built on a Nietzschean account of the heroic potential of the human individual, baited in some neo-oligarch's wet dream, in which human self-expression paired with venture capital funding is the catalyst for world-saving innovation. But between the religious undertone of environmentalism and the technological solutionism of post-environmentalism, there must be an intermediate orientation, one that acknowledges the constructedness of these categories, one that is able to hold the complexity of reality without sliding into relativism. Neither approach will alone be sufficient to restrain CO2 emissions to a level necessary to continue life on Earth and keep its quality evenly distributed across the planet. So this third element is one that problematizes the dichotomy in place. It goes beyond degrowth and accelerationism, beyond mitigation and adaptation. It is a hybrid category that transcends ideological battles. It is made up of human hubris paired with accountability, environmental conservation, and geoengineering, climate reparations, and progressive carbon pricing policies. So here is where the figure of the monster comes in as this third element that problematizes this dichotomy in place. Artificial disturbances of normative natural equilibria and the horror that they evoke are reflected in Victor Frankenstein's creature. Mary Shelley's novel was written in the year leading up to the Anatomy Act, passed in 1832, which allowed doctors and medicine students to dissect donated bodies for anatomical purposes. The breaking and making of bodies led to public outrage and fear, both of the monstrosities arising through the resumption of corpses and the ones resulting from their ripping and sewing to create something new. The masses could not tolerate the reduction of the human body to mere matter, no more special than any other chemical compound. The creature of Frankenstein embodies the danger and thrill of deliberate creation, which goes against the mold intended by nature and designs new blueprints for life. The idea of the monster has always served to police the borders of the possible, from Mary Shelley's creature in Frankenstein to the Jewish golem to Prometheus' clay humans, monsters that encouraged and warned against trespassing cultural and ethical thresholds. Monsters are cautionary tales that dictate which elements of nature are acceptable for humans to play with and which ones are not. Some can be subject to endless permutations without causing moral scandals like selectively breeding chickens to increase their meatiness, or dogs to optimize for their cuteness, or burning fossilized dinosaurs to power cars. While others are considered profane, like growing human organs inside pigs, altering atoms to generate nuclear power, or storing CO2 underground. But in times of accelerated anthropogenic climate change, the responses to avoid catastrophe need to be as artificial as the ones that caused it. So the beasts needed for this task look less like variations of human bodies and more like a polyphony of geoengineering practices, a surgery of sorts, but this time for the planet. They're made of anthropogenic monstrous infrastructure which demand constant care and monitoring. The monster is a synthesis, a hybrid between man and nature. It challenges false dichotomies. As Jeffrey Jerome Cohen puts it, the monster always threatens to destroy binaries and oppositions. It is a third party, problematizing the two, a mixed category. The monster resists any classification built on hierarchy or merely binary opposition, demanding instead a system, allowing polyphony, mixed response, and resistance to integration. So, geoengineering cannot be taken as a single interventionist approach. Geographer and writer Holly Jean Buck warns about the necessary systemic changes any geoengineering practice would require, from cultural and social geoengineering to a deep reckoning with colonial histories of land dispossession, ecological degradation, and systemic cultural and epistemological genocide. Decarbonizing Earth won't be a one-off event. It will require an understanding of geoengineering as a continuous set of practices and as a temporally extended process paired with reparation, such as continuous research on geoengineering impacts on agriculture and urbanization. Solar geoengineering also brings its own unique set of problems, such as possible ozone depletion, regional hydrologic responses, whitening of the skies, and reduction of solar power due to the impacts of diffuse radiation, not least, as climate scientist Robock puts it, the governance question of who will control the Earth's thermostat. The creation of monsters entices humans to take risks, but always within certain limits. These limits are to be found only by means of adventure and only ever by challenging the space of acceptable interventions. Philosopher Ray Brassier defines the hubris associated with creating monsters as Prometheanism. It is an attempt to participate in the creation of the world without having to defer to a divine blueprint. It follows from the realization that the disequilibrium that we introduce into the world through our desire to know is no more or less objectionable than the disequilibrium that is already in the world. The methodology of monster making calls for a certain dose of arrogance and courage, and always brings cautionary tales with it. So, the fear awakened by monstrosity can be harnessed as a strategic drive. The monster warns against misuse and abandonment. It ties humans to their creations with a mix of horror and responsibility. One cannot simply create a monster and set it free. The creature needs to be watched over and contained, not always by means of force and surveillance, but also by means of cunning. Like the scheme that Daedalus plotted to imprison the Minotaur, trapped in a labyrinth not by chains, but by its lack of orientation. The creature could have left at any point had it only known how to find its way through the meanders of the construction. The labyrinth is then the information infrastructure that keeps the danger in and the world out, isolated from each other, safe. Monstrosity is always a double narrative, one about how a monster comes to life and the other one about how it needs to be contained. So we ask, what kind of governance system must the creature inhabit so that its inhuman and ungodly characteristic can be sealed in? Governance questions surrounding geoengineering practices range from ethical and value-based concerns to their actual deployment and management of side effects. What is a tipping point that would trigger an emergency solar geoengineering intervention? How would communities affected by sudden droughts or increased precipitations caused by geoengineering be compensated? The main issue is that, as with global warming, geoengineering practices will affect different parts of the planet dramatically differently. To compose a governance system for geoengineering attuned to these realities, it is to compose a governance of planetary conditions surpassing Westphalian sovereignty, rampant nationalism, and anthropocentrism. The monster, lastly, also opens the possibility for what writer Ellen Hester suggested as a solidarity with the alien, the foreign, and the figure of the stranger, over restrictive alliance with the familiar, the similar, and the figure of the compatriot, xenosolidarity. As a governance of care scaled to humanity's capacity for complex system and distributed cognition, xenosolidarity could be the systemic approach that composes the geoengineering chimera, made up of artificial interventions that shatter technological, cultural, social, and biological normativity. It points to the need for a governance of planetary conditions which invites otherness and is able to act at the scale of the Earth systems. By reckoning with its own reason, humanity's hubris shall then be paired with the labyrinth of accountability, which decenters humans in favor of viable planetary conditions, climate reparations, and continuous manipulation of matter, a systemic miscegenation with the other, that is the matter of the planet itself. So this piece, again, I just read some excerpts, but it is roughly about kind of framing problems of environmental discourse and climate interventions, governance, trying to find like a third point of view that is not like super environmentalist, let's go back to nature, an essentialist, and between the Silicon Valley one, and so to try to find this like cultural nuances that might be helpful in articulating new frameworks for climate intervention. So trying to kind of like destroy the existing aesthetics of this current discourse around ecology. Now we can talk. Yeah, I mean, I hope you have some questions and that we can discuss about this more perhaps after the presentation. But I would like to also talk about another project that I worked collaboratively with two more researchers, which are Laura Kogusi and Anastasia Noga, which are also in the Slack. And this project is called Cassandra, from the Greek mythology. Cassandra was a woman. She could accurately predict the future, but she was cursed to never be believed. And so through this myth, we kind of developed a methodology of scenario planning specifically for climate change. And we've started applying it to different contexts. And we also work as advisors and advise different institutions on how to write scenarios and how to kind of like communicate things that we might wish will happen in the future or wish they will not. But perhaps a good way to explain this would be to play the short video or maybe some excerpts from it. This is an art. Can you? Oh my God. Sorry. Can you hear the video? Yes? Okay, cool. So let me just go back to it. Let's hear. Yeah, it's a short artwork that was developed in Unity. Yeah, maybe I'll just.
The stories that we tell about the future habitability of Earth are continuously informing humanity's chances of survival. And we are not talking about the stories that are told to the larger public, although they are indeed important, but the stories states, banks, and NGOs tell themselves and each other. These fictions guide policies, laws, CO2 emissions, influence the breathability of the air, the quality of our food. These stories are crafted here, in the boardroom. The performance of public commitments, binding signatures, and handshakes leads to delusions about actions which always happen elsewhere, in the future. In the climate science field, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has crafted 5 narratives to predict how socioeconomic parameters will guide the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They are called shared socioeconomic pathways and map 5 different roads forking into different scenarios with divergent consequences unfolding through the upcoming 80 years. There is the green roads, the rocky roads, the highway, and so on. The IPCC pathways refer to historically and culturally specific indicators that do not necessarily prioritize the thriving of ours and other species. For instance, levels of equality, education, or health are measured by their link to the GDP, a mere representation of wealth that is inadequate in addressing the existential threats climate collapse faces us with. SSP scenario modeling relies on the access and availability of socioeconomic data, which is unevenly distributed across nation-states and regions. The practice of futurology and climate change discourse often takes the shape of institutionalized wishful thinking. The role of scenario planning is to entertain fantasies of success, constantly deferred into the future, to help explain away present failures. Visualizing the future as a branching tree full of possibilities locates climate change into an outside realm, preventing us from dealing with it. The roads and branches are pictured as metaphorical paths that, it is suggested, we can choose to follow. But the reality is more complex than that. We have already crossed some of the thresholds that will trigger nonlinear and abrupt environmental change, also known as planetary boundaries. What is more interesting than apocalyptic prophecies is perhaps looking at the models that are already terraforming Earth today and think of how they can be made operational. The leakages between present, past, and future manifest.
So this video is also on YouTube, and it's actually also featured right now at the Dutch Design Week and Tbilisi Architecture Biennale. So you can check it out if you are interested in that. And it's also our website that you can visit to know more about the project. And again, although so far this has taken the shape of like a design art project, we're also actively writing this methodology and applying it and working with different institutions. And we're interested to doing that more. And to getting involved in more kind of design research work around these topics. And I guess actually this is everything from my side, because it's Friday and probably everyone wants to go and have a drink. But I would be really happy to answer some questions or just simply for people to say hi and maybe say who they are or whatever. Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you, Chiara, as well for the presentation. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any direct questions to what Chiara was talking about?
Oh, I see there's someone asking about Strelka. Yeah.
That was true.
Yeah, that was before you even had your presentation, and I was just really interested in your experience at Strelka and like what that was like.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, so this was the first year of the terraforming, which is this new program. It's a 5 month research program, and it's paid, and they take 30 researchers, half of which are architects. Half of them are from Russia, half of them are men, half of them are female. And the idea is to be in Moscow for 5 months and do a lot of research work and go on 2 field trips. And it's mostly, it's mostly work around ecology and climate intervention governance. And there is like a very, very broad range of disciplines. And also in terms of faculty, you have Kim Stanley Robinson, which is a science fiction writer, and then you have Ollie Jean Bach, which is, like an anthropologist, and you have Benjamin Bratton, which is everything. And yeah. So how my experience was, I mean, like we got kicked out of the country in March because of the pandemic. So that was quite sad. But I was there for 2 months and it was amazing. It's really intense. It's a really intense program. All the researchers were really talented and very coming from very different backgrounds. I would say the kind of work that you will do is mostly, again, like design, cultural work, but it doesn't mean that, you know, work that is more technical cannot be done. But this is just generally the kind of work that gets done because it's a short program, you know, with limited amount of time. And so this is the kind of work that normally comes out of that. But I would highly recommend it because the faculty is great. You know, you basically get paid to learn, and it's really amazing. Also, the kind of people that I met there. Were you thinking of applying in the future?
I was looking into it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I hope I answered your question. Or is it something specific you wanted to know about Strelka?
Not right now, but maybe I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, cool. I'd be happy to help. Thanks. Yeah, Joost, how do you pronounce your name?
Joost is correct, yeah, but it doesn't matter too much either way. I know who you mean. I've been juiced for years, so in the UK. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I mean, I really agree with the critique of this sort of like multiple pathways story, putting problems out in the future. I think that's an interesting, an interesting problem with futures work in general, and the metaphor around that, right? This sort of possibility space, which also has some good sides. But so my question would be, what's the alternative?
Oh yeah, well, we are working on it.
Do you have any ideas?
Sorry?
Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, we do have some ideas. We're currently working on a timeline of the future that is also based on counterfactual. So it goes like in the past, so it starts from alternative pasts, and then it like projects into the future, and it's not based on like this branching, but it's more entangled and based on counterfactual, so it's a bit more complex. And so yeah, we're working on this kind of alternative storytelling, but we are actually, we're writing more about this, and we did a lot of thinking around this, and one of the main problems of talking about the future when you're talking about problems like climate change is that climate change just happens on a much larger scale than the human cognition can begin to understand. And so stories and narratives are the only way that we have to kind of make sense of that. And so we're thinking about kind of alternative ways to conceptualize time, but mostly through writing. And so one way that's like a very practical thing we've been working on is this alternative timelines that go into the deep future.
Okay, very interesting. A great friend and colleague of mine, Roy Bender, who's a media philosophy professor at Delft, has just finished a paper which will be published soon in Futures, where they use counterfactual pasts as a sort of a way to engage with multiple futures. So as soon as that paper's out, I'll send it to you, because I think that sounds sort of very relevant. And then, I mean, one of the problems, and I think you sort of like pinpointed it also around the SSPs and everything like that, is that very notion of one present, right? And that these things are branching out from this one consensual sort of idea of the present. A few years ago, me and Roy and some other people wrote a paper about world making and scenarios, which is about the fundamental pluralism that we're living in very different worlds, right? And so each of these different worlds and has all these future possibilities and all these pasts connected to it as well. So maybe that sort of fundamental pluralism could be helpful as well for what you're talking about.
Yeah, what I found like strikingly bad about this at the SSPs is that they're based on like, it's just like, capitalism times 300 projected in the future. And I'm like, seriously, is this the best that we can do? Is this really like, it is crazy because there are these wildly different scenarios, but they're all based and all indexed to GDP or national incomes, like assuming that nation states will be a thing, 100 years from today, which I think it's a wild, like really rich assumption. And so I think it was, going even less abstract and like, what is the present, or like, like the branches structure is conceptually wrong. Like on a very practical level, just the economics underpinning of the scenarios are very basic and based on your economic.
Sure, but I think that that's a comment that many people have made, right? It's a very widely spread critique of the SSP. So I'm sort of interested in what you guys are doing that's unique. And I think the very notion that this sort of like branching paths, sort of delaying things out into the future, which I do also see other people talk about that, but I hear that a little bit less, which is quite interesting as well. I mean, in a way, I don't know if you know this, but the SSPs are in a way more uniform than the previous set of scenarios that were built by the IPCC community, which were more explicitly informed by an idea of sort of pluralist futures and different future worlds. And then the last set, they've sort of gone back to a more uniform setup, which is interesting.
Yeah, I also, from, I guess what is unique that we are doing is also from a very like writing, like language point of view. The scenarios are like one paragraph and they're badly written and they're very like, they just give no information. And we want
yes, but I actually think that's great. I think it's great that those scenarios are so short. I think that the less narrative for global scenarios like that, the better, because every time they're adding something, they're making assumptions that are basically very likely to be useless. I do use the SSPs sometimes, but in a very critical mode, and I would almost say, add as little narrative to them as possible. Just use them as a sort of plausibility envelope, and for that they're way too limited, obviously, right? But if you make sort of quantitative scenarios, just make a very broad set of quantitative scenarios that are going in all kinds of directions and provide very little logic behind them, and let people who use them provide the logic to fill it in themselves. That's what I would suggest. Just a range of background scenarios. And the less you justify them, maybe the better. I don't know.
No, I see what you mean, but the thing is that like if I look for SSPs, like normally, like the most immediate way to access that I have is this paragraph, and it doesn't actually tell me much about the quantitative indicators behind it. It just tells me like this little story.
It hides a lot of assumptions. That's true.
Yeah, it hides a lot of assumptions. Like, I would rather have, I don't know, like a matrix or like some bullet points that tell me what the assumptions are, and then I write my own story, or have a longer text, basically, or both. Because the little paragraph is just very misleading, and it's just, I don't think, if I were a policymaker, I wouldn't know what to do with that, with that paragraph, to be fair, but like, so yeah. I
wonder if Brendan has anything to say about this. Working quite closely with the SSPs as well. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Brendan. But,
that's okay. It's the middle of my workday over here across the Atlantic, so I'm hopping in and out. But I mean, just some, I guess, initial thoughts is, if you look at the supplemental information for the SSP narratives paper, they actually have some longer narrative structures that are kind of penned out for all of the SSPs, which might be bad for you, Joost, and good for you, Chiara, to look at. But I don't know. I especially from the intro to the video that you showed, I really liked the way that you kind of framed the critique of, or the way that you were approaching critiquing SSPs, because in my mind, it kind of, is applicable back to previous IPCC scenario sets as well. Like you could make the same sorts of critiques about those. And, like Joost said, the SSPs are a bit more kind of like a uniform incarnation of scenario sets that community would work with. But yeah, I don't know. They are, still fundamentally tied to very core assumptions and projections of GDP, population, energy use, like very broad things that don't, it's kind of hard for me to think about it because I can't decide on any given day whether they leave a lot of room for the imagination or very little room for the imagination. I think I tend towards the latter most days. But I think approaching it primarily from a creative writing standpoint, and a more humanities focused standpoint, perhaps, as you're doing, is a really interesting kind of approach to take. And
yeah,
I'm excited to kind of dig into it more.
I'll promise to shut up after this, but I just wanted to say that one of my PhD students, Sean Lowe, has written and he's done really interesting empirical work with the community behind the SSPs, behind the assessment modeling, around how they think about what is possible in scenarios. So I'll see if I can find a paper. I'll drop it in the chat. I think it's really interesting. Like, how do they construe possible scenarios, right? So anyway, I'll look for that. Thanks.
No, yeah, that's I forgot what I was about to say. Oh no, well, coming back to use, thanks Brennan for the input. And yeah, definitely what we're trying to do is more from a humanities creating writing standpoint, because that element is there, and it is important to really be critical about the language and the more nuanced ways in which the scenarios are written. I think it's, they're text basically in the end, so it's very important to focus on that. In terms of alternatives, coming back to Joost's question, there was this framework that was developed by the British government, I think 5 or 6 years ago. This called Scenarios for Intelligent Infrastructures or something. I don't know if you ever encounter this, but what I really liked about this scenario planning exercise was that there were 4 different scenarios with like a regular 4 square of what the future of intelligent infrastructure in the UK were going to be. But then for each scenario there was like a different take from different experts. So there was like the criminologist, was the economist, and there was the lawyer or something else. And I think that the like plurality of points of view was really what made that so great. And like also it's one of the few documents that to me look still really relevant, and look kind of like kind of almost accurate to how things went. And I think that also, this plurality of disciplines and points of view, it's really important as well. And it's something that we are trying to kind of bring into the IPCC SSP's world, because it is mostly written by economists, and I don't know, some anthropology student or whatever wrote those things. I have no idea. If you know, let me know, because it would be interesting knowing like who actually did the writing for this, and how that works. Because to me, it just seems like, a lot of economics and a lot of that kind of back end work, and then minimal front end, and also the way that this information is accessed through this like super complicated papers, and like this matrices and this like weird diagrams. It's just awful to me as a also designer and person that works in humanities, like that information from policymakers is just presented in that way, just makes it so much, unnecessarily complicated, and mystifies all of the assumptions that are in the background. So yeah. But probably you guys know more about SSPs than I do, because I just started looking into this like 4 months ago. But it was so bad that I was like, someone has to say it. But there are of course a lot of people that are saying this, but like I'll be interested in hearing more about like, what the critiques of SSPs are, and what do you think the alternatives are? Maybe like bouncing the question back at you.
Yeah, and any other questions, guys? We haven't spoken too much about the monster side of things, but
I'm sorry, maybe I just shocked you with like monster. No. Okay.
Somebody else want to go? Sarah, you want to ask? Go for it.
Yeah, I also just saw that you put some stuff in the chat, just so that the others can check that out as well. And what I was going to ask you about monster side of things was, do you think that geoengineering is sort of unavoidable and connected to the urgency of the situation that we're facing right now, maybe even desirable?
Yeah, totally. I think geoengineering will need to happen, and I think it's a good thing, and I also think that geoengineering is not simply marine cloud seedings or solar geoengineering or like very, very intrusive methods, but geoengineering is also some kind of more everyday policy making, or like, for example, the pandemic is some sort of geoengineering, if you could see it that way, because if everybody stays at home and people don't fly, then this has some kind of like scale of effect that is planetary. So to me, and I guess to like a lot of colleagues of mine, geoengineering is more about the scale of effect rather than the scale of intervention. So in that sense, I think geoengineering has been happening since forever, because human kind of effects on the planet have been massive since a long time. And climate change is also a kind of geoengineering, but that it's not engineered, because it's not planned, and it's random, and it's unpredictable, and it's bad. So how can you given that as humans we can change the composition of the atmosphere and of the geology or the planet as a whole, then how can we harness this power to do this in a more controlled way? And it's going to be inevitable, I believe, to do so. And I think that it is important that geoengineering is not a swear word, and that there can be discussions about this, because that is going to create some kind of environment where governance around geoengineering policies can be discussed, and so that the matter can be more out in the open, and there can be perhaps democratic processes around how climate interventions actually happen, rather than having the Elon Musk of the day developing something and just doing it. Because if it becomes some kind of taboo, then this is likely what's going to happen. Like, we're going to get to a point where, oh, there is nothing to do. Well, there is Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, whatever, doing something, and they're just going, because there's been no discussions. That's maybe not really a great thing. So I do, I do think that it is important, A, to have a different definition of geoengineering, which is based on the scale of effect and not intervention, and B, to discuss governance around geoengineering. I don't know how people feel about geoengineering in general here.
So, Chiara, there is a lot of work, like lots and lots of work that is already discussing the governance of geoengineering. So just be careful. I know you're coming from a different field, right? But it's just to be aware that there's lots of work going on, right? So if you say, I think we should think about the governance of geoengineering, just be aware that there's there's lots of work, especially in sort of STS space. So I just posted a paper by Sean Lowe. I'll find a few other ones, but yeah, it's of course it's a big field. Yeah.
I think I posted this as well in the Slack the other day, because I think we had some exchanges with Sarah on this like speculative geoengineering governance, tentative geoengineering, anticipatory geoengineering governance, which I found like the difference between these three warrants pretty interesting as well. But yeah, I mean, thanks for pointing that out. That I'm really interested in that. I mean, that's the whole.
There's really interesting work by Aarti Gupta, who I work with a lot, and I just posted a paper where your comment about sort of categories of geoengineering and how it is framed is very interesting, and there's a lot to it and so she looks at these assessments, the scientific assessments of geoengineering possibilities, and she describes them as de facto governance. As soon as people start writing about and characterizing and categorizing these different types of geoengineering and thinking about them and sort of like proposing that they are thought about differently, her point is that this is already starting to be the governance of geoengineering, right? Because they're authoritative assessments. So that I've just posted that paper, so you may be interested in that. So she would very much agree with your point there, Chiara.
De facto governance, how authoritative?
Yes.
What do they mean by de facto governance? Well, I guess
so that it's in fact already it's not recognized as governance, right? But it's already a governing act to assess it with an authoritative voice.
I was wondering, I mean, I really like the monsters. I don't know so much about the scenarios that were being discussed, but it's discussed later. But I really like the video. But I think a lot of the STS people that discuss geoengineering, they take the metaphor of the monster. They talk about hopeful monstrosities of everything. This large scale technologies or technologies that are dealing with complex problems are always hopeful monstrosities, because the monster is there regardless of the governance. In a way, that you have to think of a scheme that it's going to deal with the monster, because you don't know how it's going to manifest, but it's going to be there. You know it's going to happen. So I was I really like, and I think, was it Benjamin Bratton that kind of like, I think many years ago when I still had social media, I had a discussion with him about geoengineering, and I liked his position of kind of like, as you said, trying to think about it differently. But I was thinking, and maybe this relates a little bit of the scenario, and maybe I'm not making a lot of sense because it's Friday, but when you said that the scenarios are really like kind of really bad text and things like that, I'm thinking of the path dependency of all these processes, because I mean, during the 20th century, we institutionalized a certain way of authoritative scenario making. And I would really love to see more of the type of work that you do in the IPCC, but I don't know how open are we to, like, whether anybody, I feel like sometimes, and this is a very silly comment, but like last year Chile led I'm from Chile, and last year Chile led the COP 20 something 5, and it was a complete disaster, and so I think they had no idea what they were talking about. But then they were more interested in the performance of authority than actually getting the results, and I think at this point, I know it's a risky point, but maybe it is in fact the point where you should think of a different performance of the authority. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
No, this makes total sense because it's actually something we've been discussing a lot with the Cassandra team internally, of this like performance of authority and this institutional performance, and also with all the pandemic, like the possibility that maybe the COP will happen on Fortnite or something. Like, what are the new performances that that might the new aesthetics or that of institutional wishful thinking, institutionalized wishful thinking that might happen. And like the boardroom of everybody sitting in the same room and like looking nice. It's kind of something we've been analyzing, as well as the kind of like temporary architecture of COP that is always with this like carpets, and is always kind of ready for a picture to be taken of these leaders. And I mean, the performance aspect of it is probably 90% of why these things happen to begin with. And it's kind of a pacifier of like, okay, we're talking, we're like very important people here talking about climate change, and then it doesn't really matter the way that they're talking about it, what's actually happening, how these agreements are being enforced. And those are discussions that for the public are obviously very important, but like they're just not being discussed, because then all climate agreements are states drop out. And actually I wanted to also work on this timeline of what would have happened if climate agreements would have actually been enforced. So this is a kind of like counterfactual, and trying to understand. So this is like one alternative way to do it, maybe.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, actually, I really liked the, especially in the video, the way that kind of one twin kind of focus in the critique that was being developed was, this emphasis on kind of the narrative device of the boardroom and the separated levels of how things are organized moving forward into the future, right? And also this kind of content around prefiguration. I think those two things work really well because you do set up a critique where you have a performative boardroom that's prefiguring via these future narratives that they set up for themselves, kind of future performances rather than future actions, right? And like that's kind of the method that this kind of prefigurative dance takes for them, and it just kind of I guess serves to further divide between future continued thinking about acting in the future versus future action. And I think that's a really interesting space to explore, and I think the way that I'm excited to watch the rest of the video, because I think the way that it's set up aesthetically as well, accompanying those themes is really interesting. So excited to dig into it more.
Thanks. No, yeah, I think I'm happy we could communicate that. That's kind of like the main argument is that futurology is often used to defer this fantasies of success into the future rather than actually planning how do we get there and what are we going to do and how do we enforce, how do we make sure that we actually get there. It's just this, again, performance. And so then further down into the video, we actually try to look at what are the models that are already shaping the future and the kind of financial recursivity of the recursivity of some financial models, like for example the ones around oil trading as a commodity. Because in April the price of oil went negative for the first time in history, and that actually was a huge like logistics problem, and it caused a lot of like material changes that will go you know, those repercussion will, you know, we will feel for many months to come. And so we were thinking about maybe things like financial instruments like futures contracts and their derivative contracts. You know, this is like, you know, in a more speculative way, how those models and mechanisms actually make sure that the future, that the future is enforced in some way, that there are some kind of, like, it's a clear contract that happens into the future but has repercussions today. So that's actually a commitment in a sense. So we were looking like, okay, what if instead of scenario planning around climate change issues, you could have derivatives contracts or like futures contracts set up in such ways that they're binding and that it's not just a performance and things like that. So yeah, you should watch the rest of the video as well. And let me know what you think.
Actually, Chiara, can you share the video with us?
Yeah, of
or where
course.
can we watch it?
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll share it right now in the chat.
Sorry for spamming the chat with books and papers, but a lot of stuff got triggered while you were talking, Chiara, about things that relate to this. So maybe interesting for everybody to take a look at books and papers.
This is an older version with a worse voiceover, but it's still fine. We'll publish the new one soon. That's actually on the website on the Tbilisi Biennale. Maybe I'll share that one. Yeah, I'm happy. I mean, some of these topics resonate with the work that some of you are doing already. Brandon, have you been working a lot with SSPs? And if I may ask, like, in what capacity have you been doing so?
So I do a lot of work with integrated assessment modeling for different institutions, and so SSPs are kind of now the, you know, the kind of de facto baseline set of projections that people want to use in general. And so, yeah, I work with them professionally in a quantitative sense, and then think about them personally in a qualitative sense. Generally, is my engagement.
Secretly in a qualitative sense.
What's that?
You secretly think about them in a qualitative sense as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And thinking about them in a qualitative sense, and is there such a demand for that kind of work?
Is there a what?
Is there demand for that kind of work, like for thinking qualitatively about this? Because I understand, yeah, you work, you know, with
what do you mean by qualitatively?
It was a bit of a flippant division, I guess, between quantitative and qualitative, but I don't know how much demand there is for it. I mean, I think in terms of the ways which the SSPs get downscaled to smaller contexts and more localized contexts, then there's a lot of demand for, you know, fleshing them out in a narrative way to match the context that you're working with, because the global narratives and the global assumptions that go into a lot of them don't really make sense beyond that scale, and so they need to be worked with for downscaling purposes. But I don't know. I'm kind of newer to the you know, the kind of intersection of the humanities and the climate sciences and everything as a field, and so I'm exploring those spaces. But yeah, the world that I work in generally is very numerical and very mathematical, quantitative, and technical. And so in those spaces, there's not a whole lot of demand, I don't think, for that sort of work. But I think I see some exciting spaces opening up more and more for more creative applications, I guess.
Yeah,
I can just speak to that for a moment, guys. I've worked with the SSPs in a qualitative way all around the world in 7 global regions, in something like, I mean, our team worked in something like 30 countries around the world with the SSPs. And I would say that the way that we do it is we don't start with the SSPs, because obviously all the problems that you've mentioned, Chiara, and that Brandon will also readily admit, I think, not saying that you made them or anything, Brandon, are there, right? So what we do is we typically create scenarios regionally for a global region with people from all around the region first, starting with qualitative narratives for those futures. And then we have a sort of dialogue in a way from the regional level to the global level in terms of the modeling. And so we develop our own versions of the scenarios using integrated assessment models and agricultural economic models. And we compare them to the SSPs, but we sort of critically investigate the assumptions of the global SSPs. So there is really great work by, it's a little bit older, but by Monica Zurek and Thomas Henriks about coherence and consistency between scenarios across different levels. And there's a paper in Global Environmental Change that one of our team members, Amanda Palazzo, published a few years ago about our critical use of the SSPs for West Africa. And that shows that sort of like critical interrogation. And a few years ago, I was invited to Snowmass, to the IPCC community's yearly sort of internal event, to talk as a user, right? I'm essentially a user of the SSPs, but like a critical user about their use. And I would say that the more flexibility we have to critically interrogate the assumptions of the SSPs while still being able to sort of compare what they're saying globally to what we're doing at other levels. And also starting our assumptions not with the SSPs, but our scenario dimensions are also completely different kinds of things than what these SSPs are talking about. They're much more fundamentally embedded in people's concerns in the region. They're very fundamentally pluralistic, et cetera, et cetera. We have very different methods for developing those scenarios, but to still have that sort of critical exchange with the SSPs, to me, is the best way to work with them, rather than just downscaling them. I also think it's very important to realize that what we can do with models and what we can do with qualitative scenarios and narratives and all kinds of other ways to explore futures, just very different. So I totally agree, Chiara, with the critique and the frustration about the prevalence and the dominance of this model perspective on futures. I think that it works much better if the modeling work is a conversation partner in the room with many other perspectives, right? Because these global integrated assessments models, they do say useful things, but it's most useful when the people who are behind them, and many people are like this, are reflexive about their limitations, right? So when we have Detlef van Vuren, who's of course big in the integrated assessment modeling world, talk to our students about the pathways that they're developing with the image model, he will very readily say, we are not able to think about fundamentally different economic systems. We're not able to think about big governance transformations or deep cultural transformations. I mean, to some degree, they can sort of plug it in, but it's very much an abstract proxy. And I think that's the attitude that we need from working with models, I would say. So that would be my answer as somebody who works very closely with modelers, but as a qualitative scenarios person and sort of in that interaction.
So can I follow up on that as a question? So when you say qualitative models, do you mean narrative scenarios? So developing stories and possibly experiences about that?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Okay. Would you have any examples of papers where you or somebody else has worked with those quantitative models? Or
yes,
scenarios?
The paper I just mentioned, I'll post it in the chat, okay? I have a few papers from different regions around the world. So.
Okay, very cool, thanks. And Chiara, because you asked about demand, I can't tell about like demand in terms of like, is somebody willing to pay for that? I don't know, but there is definitely a large need, especially in arts and design, and I'm a designer too. And there is work done by Anab Jain and Superflux, where the qualitative scenario, are you familiar with that, Chiara? Yeah. Okay, cool. Then yeah, that's I think the most qualitative you can get.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that. That's really cool. I guess like I would be interested in like how to pragmatically apply this very radically different qualitative narratives into institutional settings, right? That's what we are interested in doing, and I think I guess that what is unique that we're doing is that like also my background is in economics, and my teammates are researchers and designers and artists, and we are kind of able to bridge this quantitative and qualitative, hopefully. I mean, that's like the goal. So yeah, and this is the thing, but it's interesting to see how Brendan says, well, I have no idea what's about qualitative in any way, and that he's just dealing with the kind of quantitative side of things. And I guess this approach of very like siloed work stream, perhaps, in writing this narratives is very clear when you read what comes out. You can see it. There is, in my opinion, probably in SSPs, you can see there is a strong disconnect between how the models have been designed, the economic assumptions that go into it, other assumptions that go into it, and then the person that writes the thing. It seems to me pretty clear that there is a bit disconnect. And like, I don't know how to fix that, but I believe that bridging that gap, and perhaps involving humanities people early and in the modeling process could be a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe to clarify a bit, so in terms of, working with the SSPs in a quantitative sense, I was just reflecting on my professional work, and that does speak to basically the silo that you identified, because a lot of, kind of everyday projects that will work with the SSPs aren't integrative of both aspects of them. And it does go back to what you were saying before about, there is a bit of qualitative content around the SSPs, but it's very poorly fleshed out for the most part. If you just look at the original source material. And so, you can expand and look at what other people have done with it, and it's a little bit better. But also in terms, I guess, another just quick thought on demand is that, the SSPs and people that work with them and the people that understand them is still kind of a bubble, I think, at this point. It's getting to be less and less so as we approach, because the IPCC will use these scenarios in upcoming assessment reports, primarily within the next year, in 2 years, I think. So, as these get deployed more and more as kind of lenses, or, kind of communicated more broadly as ways that we should think about the future systematically, then, the kinds of, I guess, criticisms and critiques that you're setting up to kind of flesh out and level against the SSPs will be also more important. So right now, I mean, when I talk to people, because I don't just work in this community, so when I talk to people who work in policy communities outside of this and talk to them about the future, and the ways that, models interpret the future and whatever, a lot of them don't know what the SSPs are and don't really care, to be honest, to a certain extent. And so, I don't know. I think the critique of them is incredibly important in understanding them more thoroughly, and understanding, obviously, of course, what institutions are looking at as our future options as well, and our future pathways. But yeah, maybe there will be more, I guess, more importance and more room, more demand for this kind of work as they get deployed more and more within the next couple of years. Because right now, I think it's still kind of a small community of understanding around them, and community of like recognition.
I mean, it's a small group of people that know what they are, but it's also the most, I would imagine, policymakers and the most kind of relevant, like important people in a sense, that like SSPs are for institutions to kind of take a look at what the future options are and what these different roads are. And so they're extremely influential, despite their dissemination to the general public is not so it's not so big. So I mean, I guess that like what our goal would be is not like to make these narratives more understandable or like to have some kind of like scientific divulgation project around these, but to question the assumptions, you know, on a fundamental level, and be in the room with scientists and climate scientists and economists and social scientists, and being able to shape what these models even are and how these stories are told to other institutions and to policymakers, so that there can be alternative futures through the translations of these scenarios into policies and laws and recommendations and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good space and a good orientation to be in. I guess all I was trying to say was, you know, there's probably going to be maybe more opportunity for that as they get deployed more and more over the next couple of years.
They will.
Hopefully. I mean, hopefully, because I think it's important. Yeah.
Do you think they will get deployed more and more? And also, yeah, I mean, this is the main narrative about future climate change is SSPs, and you know, the IPCC is the main institution. So I wonder if anybody has some insider information. Maybe you shouldn't put this on YouTube, but on like what the alternative, you know, if the IPCC is even looking into alternative ways to write these narratives, or if there are maybe kind of competitors that are doing this in a kind of explicit way, or other institutions that are doing, okay, we'll do the SSPs but better, and so policymakers should look at our SSPs or something like that. I wonder if anybody's doing that. Maybe it's more of an open question.
I think Joost wants to answer.
Yes, they. I mean, there are many attempts at this globally. One of the ones that I would maybe bring up is the Tanaloa dialogue around the national determined contributions, which is very much trying to have a storytelling mode of talking about climate change. So that's at least relevant, I think. Don't know if anybody else wants to jump on, but Rich, before we stop, because I know the time is long, but Rich here wants to say something. You want to briefly introduce yourself, Rich, before you speak?
Hi, well, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation and for the essay as well. I'll introduce. I'm Joost housemate. You know, that's my intellectual credentials for these purposes. But I just have one question that I wanted to raise about the two parts of the project, the kind of the monster and the Cassandra notion that you have. And I'm wondering, you already seem to be doing this to an extent, but I wonder, you know, can you consider Cassandra in this kind of integrated assessment modeling in the kind of SSP framework as a monster? Treat it in the monster that the way you're using monsters here as objects that unsettle ontological categories, right? They have, in a sense, agency of their own. You know, they need to be constrained because they have non-linear or unexpected impacts, and they're kind of non-neutral in a way. So were you talk in the essay about kind of thinking about geoengineering in this mode? I mean, can you, and you already in a sense do seem to be doing this, applying this kind of conceptual framework precisely to SSPs and this kind of scenario planning work. And it looks like that's precisely what you're going to do in your kind of counterfactual history work. But it seems to me that you could also apply that precisely to the way that scenarios are already developed, in the sense that they do already escape the kind of the meaning that was intended for them, precisely through the critical mode that you've analyzed. Because, you know, as a mode of governance, they have the effect of relocating climate change into the future, and therefore requiring no immediate structural or broad scale actions at the moment, because these things are already framed within very static, very well-known and very problematic economic categories. So they already have, in a sense, a kind of an agency that escapes. They are monsters, in a sense. The monstrosity in this kind of this mode is partly because they have a series of kind of what you might want to think of as like both legacy code in the way that these things are quantitatively worked out, and legacy concepts as well. So, I mean, when Joost mentioned kind of Detlef's work in the image modeling, one of the things that's a kind of like a legacy concept that's embedded simply in the fact that they're using like a really old form of code and an old form of concepts is the environmental Kuznets curve and the IPAV formulations, both of which are conceptually really, I mean, you know, largely defunct, specifically on kind of a global scale, but they still sit at the heart of the kind of the quantitative functioning of these modeling technologies. And so they're a whole mode of kind of translations between quantitative and qualitative aspects that render this kind of process a monster in and of itself, albeit one that seems to have a kind of like a negative outcome, but one that still challenges the kind of the ontological certainties, the boundaries that you're precisely looking at.
Thank you for that. It's such a lovely way to frame this two piece of work, and I didn't think about that connection, but I guess, yeah, it's really true. Thanks for that. And yeah, especially like the things like the Kuznets curve I was looking at recently, that you're talking about the inverse U-shaped curve, like GDP and inequality, and also it's both inequality and it's also pollution, or like whatever his conception of environmental degradation was at that time in the 70s or whatever he wrote that. That basically as income goes up and the economic growth happens in a country, then inequality goes down. First it goes up and then it goes down, and then same with pollution, environmental degradation. And I think like, yeah, there is still, amongst people that, for example, believe in green growth or whatever, there is still this assumption that U-shaped curve is true, and it's we'll see that, and like maybe Germany has seen that, but like because it just outsourced it to third world countries largely. But I agree that these most conceptual monstrosities are already happening in the sort of SSPs, economic assumptions things. And I think the one of the monster was more of like a fun critical theory kind of take on geoengineering, and like I'm not sure I like to kind of perpetuate that for longer, but it's still helpful, I think, to facilitate this kind of conversations that we are having. And so, yeah, in that sense, the monster is even more useful than I thought was going to be. So thanks for articulating that so well. And yeah.
Nice. I think we've been going quite a lot over time. I don't know if there's any final things that someone wants to mention. Joost wants to mention a final thing.
Of course, you can tell I'm very excited about this conversation. I'm dropping things and everything. Rich just mentioned a little bit before, and I think it's really interesting that there, and Carla also mentioned it, that there is a rich history of using the monster as a metaphor in this space, right? So it's been used a lot, and I think it would be very interesting to track that history as a project, right? To see, like, what, because for instance, I was also thinking another paper that I know that's maybe 10 years old or something by some futures people. Well, I mean, it's by Rafael Ramirez and Jerry Revitz, and Jerry Revitz is a post-normal science scholar, talking about feral futures. So they're not wild futures, they've escaped. So the idea of what you were talking about, like these futures that escape, they were thought to be tame and they've escaped. So I'll share that paper as well. So there's a lot of, and there is work by Jeroen van der Sluis about monsters and uncertainty in future scenarios. So there's lots of interesting, and you were talking about, and Carla as well, about hopeful monsters, and then there's the Cthulhu scene and everything. So there's a lot of you could almost do a review of monsterism in the literature around environmental challenges and sustainability challenges, which would be extremely fun, I think, because I think that different disciplines bring very different perspectives to the table and use that idea of the monster very differently.
Yeah, there is the Bruno Latour piece, I think, is called Love Your Monsters, but it's really like eco-modernist manifesto sort of thing. Super interesting. But yeah, we should do like a retrospective of the monster for sure. That's a fun project.
It's very fun. Yep.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, Sarah, for organizing, and Chiara, thanks for a great talk and a very stimulating interdisciplinary conversation.
Yeah, I'm really happy about the conversation. Like, and thank you so much for all the references. And yeah, I mean, if you would like to chat with me more about any of this, just you know where to find me, and I would be happy to. It was really lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Also, I think Carla asked for us to put all the papers in the papers.
I can do that, Sarah. I can do that. I've already copied them to the Word file, so I'll do that.
Awesome. Then I won't do that. Cool. Then thanks so much, Chiara, again, and hope to see you next time, all of you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Nice to see you, Brandon. Bye.